Hi, my name is Gary Peacock, and welcome to Homespun Tapes. Today with me for this presentation will also be Mike D'Amico on guitar. I'd like to thank Happy Trail for this opportunity. And for the next several minutes, we'll be exploring three areas of the playing of the bass, which I'll call the physical, the mental, and the intuitive. And those terms are only meant to be indicative of particular areas of an overall process and not to be definitive in any sense. The other aspect that I wanted to point out, or other feature, is that these three areas or three aspects of this process really aren't disconnected or separate, but they interconnect with each other, as we'll see. The actual physical approach to the instrument that I've discovered is that there should be, or it tends to be, a connection between the way and what is done with the arms and the hands and the shoulders and how that impacts on the playing to start with. The physical, for example, I found it very useful to, before even playing an instrument or be playing any sound, is simply to stay in one position that's comfortable and mentally go through the body. You can start with the feet and just get a sense of the feet up to the ankles, and then into the lower leg, into the knees, into the thighs, into the back, particularly the lower back, into the stomach area, into the chest area, into the neck area, into the top of the shoulders, and then throughout the arms, and then into the head area. And as you do this without playing, you're simply sitting there doing this, you may discover blocks or tension or even pain. And what to do about that. My experience is that simply observing it tends to disperse it or tends to unblock it. So rather than trying to release a particular tension, just observing it. And usually does the trick. Again, then, in the approach of actually playing a note or playing a pitch, raising the left hand, again being in touch with the body, and notice what is being done with the shoulder. Perhaps it's this, raising the shoulder, and simply get in touch with that. Usually, if you do that, the shoulder would simply drop by itself. Then observing the hand, whether the hand is at an angle like this, which doesn't work too well, or whether there's a smooth arc in the arm. One of the common problems that develops in playing bass is pressing or overexertion with the muscles that isn't necessary. And a good exercise that I found was to pick a note, for example, or a pitch, for example, B flat, and play this pitch with pizzicato by beginning with feeling the finger pushing the string down to the fingerboard and then producing the sound. And doing this, first of all, with the least amount of pressure. If it's the least amount of pressure, it will probably sound something like this. Not yet a sound. Gradually, a little more, a sound begins to emerge, still not very clean. Finally, we reach a point where there is a firm sound. Beyond this point of pushing down is just wasted energy. Now, I'm pulling the same way and I'm pushing or squeezing twice as hard. It's completely unnecessary. So one usually must take some time in going over this process of getting in touch with the sensitivity where you find this place where further squeezing or energy used to push down is useless. Just wasted energy. Then with the second finger, same way. Doing each finger independently. Almost there. And as you do this, again, mentally go through your arms, your shoulders, and your feet. See if there's something stuck there. And observing it usually releases it. Then the first finger. Next, observing particularly the shoulder and the arm, and realizing that this pressure that's being used doesn't need to be squeezed as much as it needs, in a sense, for the shoulder and the arm simply to relax, so that the actual arm weight is what's producing the pressure rather than squeezing. It's as though you were holding on to trying to just hold on to a pipe or something that's like this, with just letting the arm drop. If the arm does that and drops, the shoulder automatically drops as well. Then continuing across all strings. Again, always paying attention to what's going on in the body, what's happening physically. When this becomes expanded then, for example, if we're going to play a scale, and if we play, for example, just a C major scale, about this speed, we're paying most attention not to the sound quality, but most attention now just to the physical, just to the arm weight and the relaxation of the shoulder. Now, the second part then is really the mental organization, which we've covered, knowing that this is a C major scale, for example. But now listening also for the quality of the sound and the intonation, including that also in the physical. Looking at this in terms of a scale, we realize two things. One is that the scale, as I've played it, involves 3 strings. Secondly, there are several different ways to play that particular scale. This way, which we've done, then all on one string. Again, first just the physical. And as you go through playing this, where you may have seen me flinch a bit there. That was a reaction to the being out of tune. Again, simply working with the physical. Slightly out of tune. Now combining that with also with sound quality. In playing the scale this way, then, we've done 2 things. We've been paying attention to the body physically, but we've also been paying attention to the pitches. The third most important thing that I can think of, that I think is relevant, is that we're not only just hearing pitches, but we're intuiting tones. And for right now, what I mean by a tone is simply, the simplest way to express it is what we have learned as children or whatever is in solfeggio, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. For example, in a major scale. They represent tones, and those tones have specific sound, specific qualities, dynamic states, orientations. So now, combining all those, although you won't hear the tones unless you're intuiting them, it would be the same. And one can take a particular exercise this quite a ways. For example, you could restrict the playing of that particular scale to 1 string, or you could restrict it to 2 strings, and there would be these possibilities. Or it could be this. And other possibilities. It could be 3 strings starting on here, from this point. Or it could be 4 strings. A person asked me once, what's the value of doing that? The value is this that I found. Number one, if we pay attention to what shifts occur in us physically when we do it in all those different positions, that allows us to see what part of our body may be out of line when we're crossing strings. It allows us to be clear about the actual information that's on the board. What are the notes in here? It allows us to continue to reinforce the tonal aspect as well. For example, you may have noticed that in playing a scale this way, that the actual sound of the scale is ascending and the hand is descending in a way. This way it's ascending, which is an agreement, but this way is the hand descends, the scale ascends. Another value in playing on one scale on 4 strings is you'll notice is that then this becomes a way of playing, for example, and a scale, for example, in B major, all that happens is the hand shifts. This way. If one pays attention to what notes are being sounded, one begins to develop, I think, a better understanding of the fingerboard, of where the pitches are, also what happens with the shoulders, with the back, with the feet, when one does that. Again, these are all, we're looking at the physical manipulation of the hand and some of the value in that, of the value of intonation, and also just the hearing of tones. This is very mechanical kind of work. It's like, doesn't sound too musical, doesn't have any significance to begin with, like an impatience to get to the good stuff. My experience is that I've probably developed more facility from paying attention to very simple things like the physical aspect and listening very closely to what I'm playing. Probably more value from that than from trying to be theoretical about anything. The way of developing this hand, then we've been going across a bit, using the same approach if one wanted to play an arpeggio or wanted to play up and down the fingerboard. Again, if we took something like the same sequence, again, is involved. For example, first of all, the physicalness of it. Now listening, not just the physical, but now listening to what sounds that is, the intonation of it. Now, one thing that's noticed is that, and a common problem that arises in going from the lower part to the top part of the instrument is this. In other words, the body begins to move forward, the head moves forward, rather than having it be back this way. Now, this doesn't necessarily always create a problem. However, if the head is too far over this way long enough, you're going to feel it in your back, and it usually eventually creates some kind of a problem. So again, this way is to leave, basically an attempting to leave the body let the body be relaxed as possible. And notice when you're doing this, what may be going on physically with you if you're out of tune, or do you flinch? You're just paying attention to that, not necessarily trying to do anything about it, but noticing it. Again, with the paying attention to all this, the pressure of the fingers and the movement of the arm. If the bass is set up in such a way, whether you're standing or sitting, such that when you put your hand over the strings, you're pretty much covering at least 3/4 of the fingerboard, then it obviates having to move the head around. That's to say, you don't have to move the head around. Again, going back to the physical now for a moment. If you played a sequence like, and then you ask yourself to play this instead of at this tempo twice as fast, and begin to notice what happens with the hand, or play it twice as loud. One of the common errors, that's not errors, but one of the common things that happens, if you're like me, is when you first start doing this exercise, no problem in playing it mezzo forte, but if to be twice as loud, you start pulling twice as hard, but this hand starts to squeeze twice as hard, which is absolutely ridiculous. It doesn't work. It doesn't add anything. It doesn't subtract anything, except energy. So in one exercise then is going back to this physical and playing it in different volume levels. If you play it and notice what happens to this finger or the arm weight, you'll find that there's a point where no matter how hard you can pull, there is a threshold where beyond that point it doesn't do any good to squeeze. So again then, practicing a line or a fragment of scale or whatever. If it's done pianissimo or triple forte, this hand will be pulling harder than this hand will be pressing. The second part that I found, second aspect or area in working with this, and there's a question that's been asked me many times, is ear development. Since it's not a harmonic instrument, how can we use the instrument to develop our ears? Again, first of all, recognizing a particular interval, let's say. Let's take an A and an F. Now this particular interval can be produced by the first finger, let's say, and the second finger, harmonically or melodically, either this way or this way. Paying attention to the pressure and what's happening to the distribution of energy or stress on the fingers, arm weight again, also what's going on throughout your whole body. Listening to, from a basically mental level and understanding, hearing these sounds, knowing that if, for example, this particular interval is a major third. But from an intuitive standpoint, this major third may not be a major third. And we'll get to that. But noticing what am I hearing beyond just the major third? What is it that I'm hearing here? And continue to listen to it. Is it something as simple as or is it just what am I hearing here? To understand what that really means is that you'll notice that we'll tend to hear, for example, this major third. There'll be a strong tendency to hear this major third in the absence of anything that preceded it or that follows it as a mi-do or a 3 to a 1. Or we may hear it as a 7 down to a 5 or ti-so. Or another possibility is to hear it as a la-fa in the key of C. One thing that can be done with the instrument to develop that facility in ear training is to play this interval, recognizing it as a major third, and then ask yourself, which one are you hearing? Are you hearing a la to a fa? If not, what are you hearing? Well, I'm hearing a mi to a do. Fine. Now, play the same interval and hear this or intuit this interval as la down to fa instead of mi down to do. Hear it as ti down to so, and then complete it. So 3 steps in demonstrating this particular interval. One is playing the interval and hearing that. The next is intuiting what that tonal relationship is. The third step is confirmation. In other words, melodically confirm that indeed this is T down to So, or Mi down to Do, or La down to Fa. La down to Fa. Mi down to Do. T down to So. Now, we'll also note that in a major scale then there are three major thirds. If we took C, we would have Mi, E down to C, which is a major third, A down to F, which is a major third, and B down to G, which is a major third. So three major thirds in the key of C major. As a pitch interval, they are all identical, simply because the frequency ratio of the top over the bottom is identical in each case. So they're the same interval pitch-wise. Tonally, of course, they're completely different. Mi down to Do is not La down to Fa, it's not T down to So. And because of that, we can look through the scale, and we can also find that there are 4 minor thirds, 6 perfect fourths, 1 tritone, 5 major seconds, and then plus their inversions. So it comes up with like 42 intervals, and each one of those intervals can be approached in the same way. First of all, playing the interval, identifying it as a major third, a minor third, perfect fourth, whatever, intuiting which particular one it is, and then confirming it melodically. One example for this with respect to perfect fourths, for example, is the beginning of All the Things You Are. Now that opening interval of a perfect fourth, if sounded just by itself, and I didn't mention All the Things You Are, there would be a very strong tendency to hear that as a So-Do. But in fact, this one is Do up to Fa, with the harmony becomes even clearer. Another tune that begins essentially with the same pitch relationship but a completely different tonal relationship is I'll See You Again, a Mi up to a La. So again, we could go through the whole scale. There's 42, just on a major scale, 42 tonally unique intervals, which we won't do now. But then there are the chromatic intervals as well. And one, to develop their ear, just in hearing a tonal interval, you can simply invent different possibilities following this kind of like 3-step process, where you play a given pitch or play a given interval, identify that interval as to what its class is, major, minor, second, seventh, whatever, intuiting what its tonal relationship is, and then playing something that affirms that tonal relationship. An example that is really quite startling in a way was for me is the difference between now not just a particular pitch interval, but what's referred to as its enharmonic equivalent. A D up to an F, for example, or an F down to a D as a melodic interval, or simply as harmonic interval, F to D. And in this case, it could also be an augmented second in another relationship. In D minor, for example, Do up to Mi. However, in F sharp minor, it would be a major seventh down to a sharp 5, a C up to a T. And one can hear very clearly the difference in the quality of this interval as it shifts. Do up to me. In this case now major, an augmented second. And now as a minor third. Now as an augmented second. Changing it again to, instead of a minor third, D up to F as being do up to me, now actually putting it in another key. There's a minor third again. It's a mi so. And just playing with these intervals, developing whatever is necessary in order for you to be able to demonstrate what that particular interval is. Now, going back to all the things you are, and approaching this from a hearing standpoint as well as from just a physical standpoint, one, of course, first needs to be able to play the melody so they can hear the melody, and then paying attention to the form of the piece and also the root motion of the chords. Then listening to the melody internally, and then playing the root motion and listening to the relationship then between the melody and the root motion. The melody's beginning with this, if it's in A flat. The harmony being in F minor. Now, two things can happen. We can simply hear the root motion to the exclusion of the melody, or we can internally include the melody as we're playing the root motion. If we include the melody while we're playing the root motion, and the melody being starting on this pitch, we actually begin to hear what the qualities of these chords are, and further we begin to intuit the harmonic motion. Going on to the next part. If that's too difficult to do in the beginning, singing the melody while you're playing the harmonic motion can be of great assistance. Even quietly. Paying very, very much attention to the melody note, the melody tone, and the chord root, and what that relationship is. This first one, and the chord is, the melody tone is this, a do, and the root of the chord is an F. Da, and listen to this, da, up to the D flat, da, both minors. Da, 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 major third, major third again, da, 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 major third. Now, da, D. Again, with this G7, the melody note being an F, but this is a minor seventh up to a B, which is the third of the chord, but opening up an augmented fourth interval. This is really, in this tune, a pivotal point for the tune. The first part's really been in A flat, but with the F sounding da da D, we have a modulation moving into a C. So again, not just hearing the pitches, but really intuiting what that tonal motion is. This first F being more of a la, 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 la. And then up to the B, which is more T. T, T, do. So here's a case of an interval which, if we looked at it pitch-wise, is an augmented fourth. And we will hear it that way. But further, if we intuit it tonally, it has a sense of a la up to a T. To a T. Now that's curious, because la up to T in a diatonic scale is a major second. But here we have an interval of an augmented fourth in which the tones are not consistent with the pitch interval. And I bring that out because I think this is what's really makes the difference between what I mean by a tone and tonal motion and a pitch and pitch order. The ability to hear this moving, not as just the first pitch, that is, being related to D flat, the second pitch being related to C, allows us to move more deeply into the tonality of whatever is there. If we're going through this piece, what I discovered was that there are basically four major tonal areas. First one in A flat, second one in C, third one in E flat, the fourth one in G, well actually five, and then the last one in E with a turnaround going back to the top with a C, 7 chord, to the F minor. In learning a piece like this, then I realized that there was a way of organizing it mentally in such a way that regardless of what key it was going to be played in, there was a kind of map, at least a mental map of what it involved. So, for example, this was quite some time ago I did this, but if somebody mentions the tune All the Things You Are, I generally, first thing that comes up for me is a major 7, A flat, as a major 7 chord, starting on the tonic, and then coming down a minor third with a turnaround to the C. So if it was in E, for example, it would be an E major. That's major 7 in E. Coming down to a minor third, and then down to a major third, as for the chord coming back to the beginning. So no matter what key it was in, there was already a mental map of the root order and actual chord progression. Then it just required hearing the harmony or hearing the tonal order instead of thinking of the chords. Again, if the first part is an A flat, then in All the Things You Are, for example, then the harmonic motion this whole first part is in A flat. So hearing the harmonic motion, basically intuiting the movement in A flat, one isn't restricted to simply thinking chord, and then B flat minor, and then E flat 7, and then A flat, and then D flat major, and then G7. But rather hearing the harmonic movement internally, so that when one is improvising, one simply affirms or reaffirms that harmonic movement. In A flat. But then what I also discovered was that to develop a more rigorous understanding of the fingerboard is to play it in a key that it isn't played in, and simply play it through all the keys, actually. It's very rarely played in C. So by playing the melody in C, and then by understanding what the harmonic scheme is, having a mental map of that, and then understanding and hearing and intuiting what the harmonic sense of it is about, just begin improvising in the key of C. The first chord in the key of C then begins on A minor, and basically instead of hearing an A minor, D minor, G7 to C major to F major to B7 to E minor, is really hearing a harmonic movement as it would be in A flat of 6 minor to 2 minor to 5/7 to 1 major to 4 major, and now to a 5 of a B7 and down into E major. A minor. One could pick any number of keys. You can pick E, B, and that can be a very useful way of simply learning, getting a better command of the fingerboard and reinforcing an intuitive understanding of harmony and also of harmonic movement. I've been asked many times about from different students of the relationship between scales and chords and what works with what works. And to me, there is some value in simply understanding what the pitch order or a scale, what the relevance that has with a given chord or chord structure. But without intuiting what the function is, that is to say, a C7 as a 1 function or a 4 function or a 5 function, the scales themselves leave a lot to be desired. In fact, if we just function on the scales through the exclusion of the function, it seems to reduce our options or the possibilities of something much wider than that to be available. And for every rule that you can come up with about what works with a given chord or a scale, there's going to be someone who breaks it and breaks it in a meaningful way. From my own standpoint, hearing what the function is becomes the guiding principle in improvising with respect to a chord. So although, yes, we do hear chords, which are pitch connections or pitch ensembles, but the intuiting of the chord as a function gives it a harmonic stance. An example of this would be if we took a C7 chord, and if you've gone to school or studied, you'd learn, well, what works over that is a G minor melodic ascending, or perhaps a D flat melodic minor ascending, or perhaps a diminished chord, a whole step half step starting on C sharp. And yes, just given the C7 chord, if one actually plays those scales over that chord, there seems to be some relationship that seems to work. But the scale itself is just a pitch set. And the real significance of the musical significance is what the tonal intent is going to be. And that's through the tones. So, for example, if I'm hearing a C7 and it's a tonic function, I will automatically, and you will find that you will do the same thing, you will hear or intuit this chord as a tonic function, and that will shape and determine to a great extent what you're going to play. And Mike will play a C7 now, and we'll treat this as a tonic function. Okay? Now that's just a tonic function. That's really hearing the C as a do. Now there's another way that's not uncommon, and that is to hear it as a 4 chord. Now in this case, the actual center, tonal center is G, not C. So, hearing it as a 4 chord, playing the same chord, or if we want to embellish the sense of that it is more of a 4 chord in the key of G, again. And notice that how this, hearing it this way, if in fact we do go to the G, then it becomes even more dramatic. So we can go to a G7 after that, right? By the line itself, and back to C again. Again, then taking the same chord but as a function, treating it as a 5 function. So the actual scale that may go over a chord, I think in a sense is incidental to the actual melodic intent that you will intuit through that as a given function. Now a similar thing can be looked at in the reverse. That is to say, not what particular scale goes over a chord. One can also ask what scales go over one, or what chords go over one scale. Usually it's approached what scale over a chord, but you can also approach from a standpoint of what chords will work over a given scale. And then again, whether that scale or that system is consistent with one chord, or whether it's consistent with others, or whether it's actually stretched out a ways. An example of that I'd like to demonstrate is a scalar set, but in which the tonal order is basically saying C is do, but moving over harmonies that are ambiguous in a way. If we took a C major down to a B7, to a B flat 7, to an A7, we can ask ourselves, okay, if we want this to be in the key of C, what about a melodic line that over the entirety of those changes, that melodic line says and reaffirms the key of C, not a bunch of different scales? Then there is a way to do that, where the line itself is not so much chromatic as it is diatonic in the key of C. And if we took these about this speed, then one example would be 1, 2, 3, 4. Again. But if I want to make it completely diatonic, it creates a bit more of a restriction on what can be done. Now those were strictly all in the key of C, again. And then moving back to C. Again, 3, 4. Now notice that one thing that happens in here is that the line the actual melodic line that's being played is so diatonic that the harmony now becomes revealed in a more of a in a way that it really begins to sound like harmony. These functions become 1 to a 7 to a flat 6 or flat 7 to a 6. Whereas if we're simply operating, looking at scales to play over those changes, it becomes a little bit more ambiguous, in which each particular chord starts to sound like a tonic function rather than a function in a key. Another example of this that I found useful was actually revealed to me by none other than Paul Desmond after years and years ago transcribing part of his solo on Stella by Starlight, a tune called Stella by Starlight, in which I was surprised to find out that a large portion of his solo in the beginning was diatonically in the key of B flat. There were really no chromatics anywhere. And if you know the Stella by Starlight, for example, begins with an E half diminished 7 to a 7/7, A to a 7/7, A7, then to a C minor to an F7, and then F minor 7, B flat 7 to E flat major. Now those are a lot of changes, and some of those are chromatic. But his line basically was centered basically diatonically in the key of B flat. And we'll try that one too, just in the after all, the melody is completely in B flat. So to demonstrate the difference between that, starting with this tune just in the beginning, and we'll keep it that way. 2, 3, 4. One more time. 3, 4. And then contrasting that with actually listening to these, because this E minor 7, A7 can behave as though it were a 2 minor 5/7 of D minor. So there could be two different tonalities. One, D minor moving into a B flat minor, a B flat major. So that we have two systems, a B flat system, beginning in D minor systems moving in this way to a B flat system. And the line then that one would hear would be somewhat different. 2, 3, 4. Another one could actually be treating this as a movement into D major or minor, right? Instead of D minor, D major. 3, 4. So there's any number of ways that this can be, that it could be intuited. I found it valuable for myself, found it very, very valuable to working with any given piece was to stretch the possibility of keeping the entire harmonic scheme in one key. It's rather challenging. It can be done. But in doing that allowed me to hear the chords more as functions than as to hear them just as static entities. And my tendency was basically to hear the chords and try to figure out what to play over those chords rather than actually hearing all the harmony. And one way to accomplish hearing it more as a harmonic movement was just that, simply to play, first of all, to play the melody, because the melody is most generally in that key, and that reveals what those functions are. But then in terms of improvisation or playing over that, what to actually use as well. So we'll play this probably, let's play this in B flat, and you'll probably hear combinations of both of those. Come on. Next, playing this tune then, again, as we went through and all the things you are, playing it in this key, a B flat, and learning it well in that key. Then simply moving it into a different key, into G, or into C, or into F. And all the time paying attention to, physically to what the chord root motion is, finding some way to mentally organize that. By the way, I want to say that the mental organization of a given piece can be very valuable, but each person seems to have their own special way of doing it. So the way that I go about doing it may not be the way you go about doing it, but it's very useful to be able to track the way that you do that, to understand what your process is in going about that. So it's not necessarily a specific recommendation that I wanted to give. Also, how you handle what's going on with the physical aspect. You simply have to pay attention and find out what necessary things need to be done. Because all our bodies are different, our hands are different, our arms are different, everything's different. The mainstay of traditionally of jazz has always been blues and the so-called rhythm changes. And just usually the starting point for many musicians that are getting involved with jazz, or at least used to be the case. So we'd like to conclude today with taking a look at rhythm changes and the form, and going again through both the physical, the mental, and the intuitive aspects of that. The actual form, if you could call it that, of the rhythm changes is essentially an A-A-B-A kind of form, in which the A's and the B's are 8-bar segments. The progression involved, or the harmonic motion involved in each of those sections, that is to say the A section and the next A section, those are the same, essentially the same sequence. The bridge is a long kind of what's referred to as a turnaround, coming back to the final A, which is, again, a repetition of the first 8 harmonically. It's very common for this to be played in B flat, which we'll do a little later, but it's also very instructive to, at least particularly for the bass, to look at it in the key of B, since B literally forces the hand to be in positions that leave very little opportunity for open string movement. So it enhances an understanding of cross-string motion and a fuller understanding of the fingerboard and where the notes are, where the pitches are. It also will bring up then certain physical aspects where the body may tense because the arm is getting tired. So it's an opportunity to, again, pay more attention to finger pressure and how that's used and how that can be relaxed a little bit more to shoulder, the stomach, legs, ankles, the whole body. In a sense, I can't stress that aspect of it too much because invariably, if there's a problem musically, it's always reverberating somewhere physically. It can be the neck or the shoulders, but somewhere it will show up there. The actually hearing of the changes requires listening to what the root motion is, but more importantly, in a sense, is to hear what the functions are. For example, in B flat, the harmonic motion would be in a tempo 1, 2, 3, 4, like this would be. And then this repeats. And the bridge, 2, 3, 4. the curious thing about the bridge is that these are all dominant seventh chords traditionally. So in B flat, we're starting with a D7 dominant 7 chord. But this chord can be heard and is heard as a seventh chord, D, F sharp, A, C, for example. But what is its function? This can be intuited as a 3 function or a 5 function. It's very commonly treated as a 5 function, but in a very interesting way. That is, we will intuit the D7 as a 5 of G, but immediately upon arriving on the G now becomes another 5 chord going to C, which now becomes another 5 chord being followed by F, which just returns the 5 chord coming back to B flat. So what's implicit in the bridge in this is a pan tonality. It's essentially a panning. If this is a D7, it's a 5 of G, then we're essentially on our way to G. So we're essentially in G, on our way to G at the same time. And immediately upon arriving on the G chord, we're in the key of C, moving towards C. Then G, then C, then F, and finally back to B flat. So what it involves then is a shift, an intuitive shift in hearing these chords as functions that pan through different keys. Without that understanding, we're basically stuck with trying to do something over a D7 chord. Now, where that isn't wrong, there's nothing that I would say was wrong about doing that. If all we're hearing is the chord as a tonic function, then we're jumping from one key to another key. And so there's a lot of smoothness that will tend to be lost in the process of doing that. However, if we're hearing the D as a 5 going to G, and immediately upon the G, this is already going to C, then we begin to hear in a different way. Creates a bit more of a smoothness. Now, what I did in there is knowing that the D7, hearing this as or intuiting basically this as a 5 function of G, and literally hearing with that D7 more like 2 minor 5/7, and then 2 minor 5/7, and then 2 minor 5/7, and then 2 minor 5/7, which is essentially the same kind of movement. But if it's difficult for you to hear, for example, a D7 as a 5 that's moving to a 1, which is changing to a 5, or it's hard to hear the D7 as being related to a G type of tonality, then the assisting of the playing of the A minor prior to that to the D7 can be of some value. Then, as you'll notice, if it's in B flat for the bass, a lot of open strings. However, if we move to B, then it puts an additional difference in it. So in the key of B, it would be essentially now notice that in each case, with the exception of the E and the A, it's all closed positions. Becomes, again, at the bridge, at the bridge, all closed, no open strings. Now, there's many different variations on the actual harmonic movement of this piece. And after playing it several different ways, instead of just one begins to hear whatever. So it really involves playing it in many different ways. We're going to take it in a very simple way today. But you get used to hearing all the different variations on it, and then you're basically still hearing the changes of the harmonic sense in it. So in this case, this requires that the hand move more across the board, which may bring up something physical. It demands being in tune, and it demands still maintaining the intuitive response. So let's play this, just improvising in it in B major. 1, 2, 1. Thank you. Mike D'Amico, I'm Gary Peacock. Thank you.
Thank you.